Next, let's talk a little bit about desert landscapes and also wind erosion while we're here, because wind erosion is very effective in desert landscapes. So in dry environments, like in transmontane California, in the deserts, like in the Mojave and Sonora deserts, you don't have that much vegetation, and you don't have, the vegetation doesn't hold the soil down because of the lack of it. So you don't have the roots, you don't have the leaves to break up the rainfall, and it makes erosion much more effective in these desert environments because they're not protected by vegetation. One thing to note is that there's different types of streams. We can classify them as, in wet areas, we have what are called perennial streams, and these are streams that run year-round. So for example, the San Joaquin River, sometimes it's higher and sometimes it's lower, but it always has water in it. However, in dry regions, the rivers don't always have water. Some have water for part of the year. These are called intermittent streams. If you've ever driven through the town of Madera, there's a small river that runs through the town. Part of the year it'll have water and part of the year it will not. Basically, when there's snow melt, it'll have water, and then the rest of the year it doesn't. But when we get to the driest environment, we're limited to what we call ephemeral streams. These only flow when you get a rain event. Otherwise, they're just simply dry. And in fact, what you see in these desert environments is not a stream at all or a river. What you see is actually a dry channel, and those are called an arroyo. These are the channel of an ephemeral stream. And by the way, just one thing to note, when we talk about rivers or creeks and things like that, usually we can just call them all streams. It makes the terminology easier. Sometimes deserts do have running water through them. It's called an exotic stream. They're not common, but what can happen, the Nile River is a classic example in Egypt, that you have a wet part of Africa that supports water that runs all the way through the desert in Egypt. And here in California, the Colorado River is an example of a exotic stream. It starts in wetter parts of the United States and then runs through the deserts of the interior. Although actually it doesn't make it all the way to the ocean because we, use the water for irrigation. Now, wind is an effective erosion agent in desert landscapes because, again, the lack of the vegetation to hold material down. So as the wind moves along, it will actually blow some lighter material in the air, and heavier material, it will either bounce around or kind of slide around the bottom. And like streams, it also makes deposits as well. And there's a couple of thicker material, and heavier material that are sand, which are larger particles of material, will be formed into sand dunes. If it very light material or dusty material that goes further and gets deposited even further is called loess. Let's talk a little bit about landforms that we find in desert environments that are somewhat unique to them. And there's different types of, let's just jump to here, desert environments. And this is what we call a basin and range environment. And basin and range is the type of landscapes that we find east of the Sierra Nevada in the basin and range environment, and including places like the Mojave Desert. And we'll take a quick look at a few features like alluvial fans, bajadas, and something called a playa. So alluvial fans are stream deposit features that have a very unique fan-like shape. Typically what happens is that it's a stream channel that's confined in a narrow valley, and when you get a rain event, the water just rushes through this canyon, and it has a lot of power to move the sediments, but once it escapes the canyon, all the sediments get deposited very quickly because the river suddenly slows down from after it leaves the canyon. So it leaves this debris behind in this fan-like pattern. Now, if you take a bunch of these alluvial fans and they grow and combine together, it actually makes a longer feature called a bajada, which is just a bunch of joined up alluvial fans. And the third type of feature is a playa. So at the lower parts of these basins, the lower elevation areas, you have an this is where all of the water ends up. Another term for this is an ephemeral lake. So like you can have an ephemeral stream that only runs when there's a rain event. Those ephemeral streams will make their way down into an ephemeral lake called a playa. So these are typical of areas that are what we call have internal drainage, meaning that the water does not go all the way to the ocean, it just pools up in the desert. So this is a playa on the desert floor. These are ephemeral streams that are connected to the playa. After a rain event, it'll have water, but that water will then evaporate, leaving behind usually a lot of salty, sort of a salty bottom area. That's why they're so bright shaped, because of the salts that are left behind.